over it to make sure that it sounds good and it's also concise.
Yeah, and I would also say be sure to specifically list the schools where you've done your practicums and your student teaching. One of the things that drives me crazy is when folks say Wake County schools, right? Like that doesn't help me at all when someone lists a district. So you want to be very clear on where give me the school, tell me the grade level, right? Like put those things in there because all of those things kind of give good information for us. And then I would say I'll jump to the other question in terms of a cover letter. So I occasionally get to them, right? Like so I kind of work through this process of application to resume to cover letter. And lots of times the cover letter, when I'm trying to narrow it down who I want to talk to, that's the spot where I'll bump to a cover letter. But just for what it's worth, I don't know if it's the same for everybody else. I tend to read that third.
I don't know about the rest of you, but one thing I do too is I don't tend to look at cover letters very much, but I will say cover letters that are personalized for the school mean more than just a standard cover letter that you're going to send everywhere. But I also think it shows a little initiative when you send an email to the principal when there's an opening. Some principals might not like that, but for me, I get 100 applications in our system when I have an opening. I might get 7 or 8 people that take the time to write me a really well-written email that has a paragraph or 2 that shows that they know something about my school. They really want to be here. That goes a long way because typically those are the first people I start with when I'm setting up interviews for a position.
Yeah, and a lot of times I was going to say the same thing. So I'm glad you said that. A lot of times I'll even reply, especially if you attach that resume to that email, right? So I can glance at it. Mm-hmm. Lots of times I will even reply and copy my administrative assistant to set the interview up off of the email. So Jamie does, my admin assistant does all the setting up. But a lot of times when the emails come through, those are the people who get interviews first. Because I'll reply and say, thanks for your email. I'm copying Ms. Wheeler to set you up for an interview.
And when we don't reply, that might just mean, even though it looks like we have an opening, there really isn't an opening. So sometimes we're just shifting people, or we know of somebody going in a position. We probably don't spend a lot of time replying to all the emails we get on those kind of cases. But when we're really looking for somebody, we do pay attention to those emails.
Yeah, I was going to add something similar to what you just said, Mary. So I'm glad you captured that. And also in the cover letter, I think I'm on the lens of, like, I look at the resume first. But some districts ask for the resume in like the NC Teacher Match. I know my county, we're in Eastern North Carolina and we use NC Teacher Match. And I think the system does require a cover letter. So for those purposes, it's there. But as far as myself, my principal, we look more so at like the resume, and then like the interview process is a really big process for us. So the cover letter for us is a nice to have. So in some cases, you might find that it's required before you submit your application, but you still want to have something that's very nice, very well thought out. And the touch with the email, I think, is also, it helps you stand out. So feel free to send that email. Even if you feel uncomfortable about it, just send. It doesn't have to be long, something concise. Because also, like, school leaders, we're always constantly working. So something concise is very helpful. And like Michael said, having an opportunity to get that interview set up would be very nice from that email.
All right, thank you. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, we will have an open Q&A at the end. So if you have more questions on resumes, you can save them for the end. Moving on, now for the interview. What are your favorite questions to ask teachers during interviews, and what kind of responses are you looking for from your questions?
So
I'll start.
No, go ahead, Jamila. You're good.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the process that we use, it's they're like behavior type of questions, and it's not necessarily like do you do the right things at all the times? But we ask you to tell us stories about a time when. And the thing I really like about those questions is that it moves from the generic, well, I mean, of course, we ask, like, tell us a little bit about yourself. So people give us their prepared answer to tell us about themselves. But then we also ask very specific questions that give us a lens into, okay, in this type of situation, what are the things that they're saying they would do or like have done? Because that gives us insight into like the type of person that you are. It gives us insight into like how you handle change, how you handle relationships with other people, whether it's with students, adults, your colleagues. And I think that those questions have been very helpful. It's called BEI. But I think those questions have been very helpful for us in like helping us to get very clear on like who we're looking to hire and like a best fit for our team. And B, it helps us to be able to get to know you deeper within like the 30 minutes or whatever the interview time is. And so like what kind of responses I'm looking for, just being yourself, being authentic to you. I know when people are giving me the runaround, I know when people are telling me what they think I want to hear. I don't personally want to hear that. I want to hear your authentic answer. I also would prefer to hear if you don't know, like to say you don't know, especially like becoming new teachers. You may not have had every experience in your practicum field experience. So it's okay to say, I don't know, but every answer shouldn't be I don't know. So I would rather, you know, an applicant being honest, and an applicant being very clear and again, concise, because sometimes stories take a really long time. So being concise in your story is also really helpful. And I'll pass it to Michael.
Yeah, so I'm in a similar, do something very similar. So all of our questions are built around scenarios. So we set up everything looking for a scenario. So when I'm interviewing, I'm ultimately interviewing for three things, right? So I think that if I can find a person who cares about children, is intelligent and has good judgment, I can teach them how to teach, right? So like I'm interviewing for those three things. And so our questions are all set up really around those three things. Like, you know, I try to get folks to give me some insight into like, what would it really look like in a classroom, right? If I brought you in my building and I put you with my kids, what would that look like in my classroom? So I don't go with the question of like, just tell me a lesson that you enjoyed. Like that to me is not really getting at what teaching looks like, right? I want to see what it looks like day to day. And then I'll give you my favorite question. And I'm not going to tell you the answer to it, but I'm going to give you my favorite question. Okay. So ultimately what I'm looking for are people who share my positionality about how we treat each other and children, right? Like that, ultimately, that's what I'm looking for. And so one of the questions that I ask really early in an interview is, if you have a child who has never missed an assignment and they come in on a Monday and they don't have an assignment that's due, and you query around that and you ask them and you find out that, you know, life happened, right? Like they had soccer tournament on Saturday, they had church on Sunday, something happened, just didn't get it done. And then on Wednesday, that child shows up before school and they have that assignment and it's done and it's complete. And when you grade it, it's a 100, it's the best one you have. And my question for the candidate is, what grade would you give that assignment? And I tell them, don't try to guess where I'm at with this. Because, you know, I work in secondary schools, right? So I could go either direction on it. And what I'm looking for is somebody who shares my positionality of we treat behaviors as behaviors and academics as academics, and we grade against the standards, right? Those are the things that I'm looking for. And the honest answer is we had a candidate last summer or your summer before last, pre-pandemic, who actually got up and walked out of my office on that question. Which was good because on paper he looked really good. And the reality is he would have never been able to work in the school where I am the principal because what we believe about teaching and learning, it doesn't match. So I go with lots of those questions. And then my advice out of those is you have to be honest, because you don't want to end up in a situation where what you believe and what the principal believes don't match each other, right? That's the worst situation that you could possibly be in because you won't be in it for long. So I would say just as honest as you can possibly be on your answers.
I think that is such good advice, Michael, because I always tell people it's like a marriage. You're going to spend as much time at our school or more time there than you do with your family even. So it does need to be a good match for both you and the school. So I think being honest is really important. I also look for 3 things with candidates, and all of my questions revolve around those 3 things. One is, do you know your purpose as a teacher? So I might ask you questions, a lot of questions around that same central area, and they sound easy. Why do you want to be a teacher? But teachers that just say, I just love kids, or I love math. Like, yeah, you can love math and you can love kids, but that's not your purpose. Your purpose should be something like, I love to grow kids. I love to get a child and figure out what their needs are and move them to where they need to be. I love to, use my data to drive what I'm doing. So all those things are talking about student growth, and those are powerful answers to me. Another area I look for is just kind of teaching learning strategies. Like, do you know how to engage students? Do you know how to differentiate? Do you know how to use data? So a lot of my questions, they're all scenarios, just like they mentioned before, but they're scenarios that revolve around that one topic. Know this, I don't expect beginning teachers to come in knowing those things. I'm like, Michael, I can teach you those things. But the third category is all about relationships. And I can't teach relationships. So I need to know where you are with your relationships. So I might ask you a question like this. You're meeting with a parent to discuss a student that has some behavior issues. The parents blame some of the child's behavior on you. How would you handle that? So what sometimes people say is, I would show them what this child is doing. I would prove my point. I would, like all these different things to show we're right. But a relationship answer might be more based on, I would listen to the parent. I would try and think, are there any things I could change in myself? I would work collaboratively with the parent and even the child. See, when you put that child in there, that's the perfect mix to come up with a plan to improve their behavior. So it's not that you're going to take all the blame for the child's behavior. It's just a true relationship is you listen first, try and apply in order to build that relationship. So then you can come up with a collaborative plan together.
Awesome, thank you. Those are some really good questions. So this is kind of the flip side. What questions have you maybe heard during an interview that you like to hear from teachers that you're interviewing, and what questions have people asked you that you're like, don't ask that during an interview?
So I would say you have to have questions, right? Like, it always drives me crazy when I get to that spot and I say, well, what questions might you have for us? And you have none, right? Like, that drives me crazy because you didn't prepare. You didn't, because the reality is you do have questions, right? If you really want this job, you do have questions. And so I just always say, I'm always kind of expecting questions there. And then what I'm really kind of listening for on the question side of it is the same thing that I'm listening for when I ask the questions, right? Like, you ought to be probing me to find out whether you fit in this place, right? Like, that's what you should be aiming for there. So we get some really good questions about school culture, right? Like, the school that we're at does a really good job with students that other schools have a difficult time doing a good job with, right? And so we're proud of that. So when someone comes in and sees that and knows that coming in and asks us about that, that's an important piece of the puzzle. It means you did your homework. And then we get some questions around, and we interview by committee. So I really love when folks come in and I try to steer those questions toward our teachers, right? Because they answer them way better than I do. And they're in the similar positionality of the person that's coming in. So a lot of things about just culture and what do you like and how does the school, how does the school support kids? But what you should be probing for is, is this school a good fit for me? And I'll think about the second question. I'll let everybody else go, and then I'll give you a good not question in a second.
Whoop, we can't hear you for some reason, Jamila. Well, I'll go while you're figuring your
Oh, wait.
volume. Oh,
Can you hear me?
yep.
Okay, yes. Go ahead, Mary. It's fine. Let me try to figure out what's going on.
Okay. I think some really good questions too are candidates that look at our website, that actually try and figure out who we are, what we're about, and even read through the school improvement plan or stuff like that. It's pretty short, but like we had a great example of questions to ask and not ask this last week when we were doing some interviews. One candidate said, I noticed on your website that you guys are working on personalized learning pathways. I'm not sure what those are. Can you explain those to me? That was like an awesome question. We don't expect you to know all the little things that we're working on in our school improvement plan, but the fact that she read through that, was interested, and asked the team about that then, that was a great bonus point question for her. There were also some candidates that did not ask good questions. And I will tell you, my teachers picked up on these questions even more than I did as a principal. And the candidates were done not based on what they answered in the questions we asked, but the questions that they asked. So one teacher wanted to know what the minimum hours were for the school day. They're done. They wanted to know what duties they would have. So when you're asking questions like that, prep time, duties, all that kind of stuff, that we're a really relationship-driven school that goes above and beyond to do what kids need. And then that just sounds to my teachers like that person's not a good fit for us because they're looking for the minimum. Oh, and one more thing too. Sorry, I just remembered one more thing. Also, at the elementary level, people, don't say, I only want to teach second grade, because we're really looking for more flexibility than that. So you could say, second grade is my dream level, but I love teaching and I'm really open to teaching anything from first through fifth grade. Something like that makes you way more hireable than somebody who just wants this one little thing.
Love that. And I will say, like, in addition to those points, y'all can hear me now, right?
Mm-hmm.
I sound okay? Okay, perfect. So in addition to both of those points from both Mary and Michael, I would say, so I work in a smaller school district, again, in Eastern North Carolina, but like the work we're doing is really impactful and meaningful work. So at my particular school, we are doing, and this is all going to lend to like what kind of questions to ask, right? So we're leaning into a new model for teaching and learning. I'm very excited about it. Like you've heard so far, our school is driven by relationships. Our school is really driven by every child can grow, every child can succeed, and every teacher can grow and succeed as well. So knowing that, what I look for is for folks to look on our website to take a look at what we're doing. Social media is another good place to look for schools because oftentimes schools will put what they're working on social media, like we use Instagram and Facebook a lot. So that could be another place to go and look and say, okay, what are they working on? You know, what are some things that they're doing in the community, and asking questions around that. I'd also say taking a look at the district website also gives you an insight into like what district you're joining or would be a part of, because there's other opportunities in specific districts. So I know in particular our district, we have opportunities for growth and development with technology. We have opportunities for like teachers to step up into leadership through opportunity culture, which is like what I do. So if you're at a school like that, or you see that like your school is like that and / your district, you might want to ask a question around that, because there might be specific initiatives that your school district that you're applying for offers, and it might be helpful to know a little bit more about what that is and how that might impact you. And I think like based on what you've heard so far, my thoughts aren't any different. But definitely doing your research, looking at the school's website, social media is helpful, and preparing questions. Also, I think that though I was in the teacher ed program, I guess I underestimated how much I needed or would like to have known before I had actually started my first teaching position. So like Mary said, asking those real questions about what are the hours, what are the expectations for like a work day? What are like committees or like PLCs? What do those look like? Like logistical questions like that could be helpful. And those might be answered based on your interviewer, or that might be something that you're really interested in and want to know, and there's space to ask that.
Awesome. Moving on. This is more general, just the leftover interview questions, but what are some buzzwords or topics that you like to hear about during the interview? What do you like to hear about from teachers who just graduated college, who we haven't ever really taught in a real school before, at least not on our own? And what do you not want to hear about during the interview? And just any other general interview advice you have.
I think what sometimes new teachers do is they do use buzzwords like positive relationships and differentiation and that kind of stuff. But I want you to come in and be confident about experiences that you really have had. So as new teachers, you've all had experiences in the classroom already. So you could say, relationships are important to me. So one way I get to know my students is I survey them. I use a journal. So those little things that you have done along the way, those are great examples to kind of support those buzzwords. So just to say, I differentiate instruction, that's not as meaningful as when you say, I give my unit assessments and I'll do a pre-test to figure out exactly what the kids need and drive my instruction. I pull small groups over based on exit tickets along the way. And then I use a post-test to figure out what they've learned. Like whenever you can apply just little examples like that, you've got a lot of experience and that comes through and shines through. I can remember one teacher I was interviewing one time, and this was with a team of teachers. She was a beginning teacher, and she gave an example of something from her Sunday school class where she taught. And it was the perfect example. So they don't expect you to have tons of experience in full-time classroom teaching positions, but you've all had experience with kids and with teaching. So just use those experiences and be confident in those.
Yeah, and I would say, straight off of what Mary said, when I interview, I am looking for folks that are passionate about making kids' lives better. And you got into this, you've done an undergraduate degree in this, right? Like you didn't go into this instead of public policy or economics because you didn't want to do this. So I want you thinking about those kind of things. And I always open it up to folks and tell them, especially when I ask the question about, what would classroom instruction look like? And I say to them, capture that however you want to capture it, right? Like think about a time that you've taught someone how to do something and tell me about that, right? So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to capture everything. And again, I'm not really looking for the buzzwords. I'm gonna be real honest with you. Lots of times when folks drop a buzzword on me, I am going to probe to find out if you actually know what you're talking about with that, right? Because the reality is I haven't met a lot of first-year teachers that differentiate very well, right? That's a skill that gets learned. You don't learn that until you've done this a few years, right? I always tell people I stayed in the classroom half of my career, right? I spent 15 years teaching school. And I'll tell you, I don't think I was really good at that until year 7 or 8, right? Like I started learning how to do some of it, but I got really good at it about year 7 or 8. And so the reality is I don't expect a first year teacher to come in. And when a young teacher drops a word like, well, I differentiate, like you don't, like you think you do, but you don't, right? Like you're going to learn how to do that because that's my job, right? Like my job and my lead teachers are going to teach you how to differentiate. And so I would say be really careful with those buzzwords, because it does throw up red flags for us, because we know that you're a novice teacher. We know that we're going to have to work with a teacher that we hire as a first year folks, you know, and I, you know, a lot of my folks, I'm probably in the wrong forum to be saying this, but like I hire a lot of folks coming out of teaching fellows and out of teacher ed programs, but I also hire a lot of non-traditional track people, because they can tell me how they taught a kid to swim. Right. And to me, if you can teach a kid to swim and you're smart and you have good judgment, well, I can teach you how to teach English. Right. Like, so I would say be really careful with the buzzwords. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. Share the things that you do know and share them honestly. Right. Like I'm looking to get to know who you are and establish whether I trust putting you in a classroom with a limited number of minutes of kids' lives. And because that, you know, I go into my year knowing we've got a limited number of minutes with kids, and I got to trust you to do that. So I really want you to tell me who you are, and I'll probe around those other things, and be careful not to throw buzzwords in, right? Don't go with those just because you think because we're good principals are going to catch them.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, you can hear me. Okay. So I'm definitely not a buzzword type of person. Like I said before, you know, being honest, being truthful is more meaningful to me than can you say a hot topic on trend education word. I'm going to read right through that. And like, I'd rather hear your honest, true experiences. I like hearing from my teachers about experiences they've had. Thinking about some interviews I've done recently. So experiences they've had outside of the classroom and how that shaped how they view the world. Because I think that perspective is really important to consider when you're looking for who is the best fit for our team and what will they contribute and bring to our team that makes the experience special and unique for kids. So I love hearing about experiences that teachers have had. Like I had a teacher that went to do something abroad in South Africa, and I thought it was a really cool story she told. And she, talked about how that experience was one of the ones that solidified her decision to want to become a teacher. And so she didn't take the traditional pathway into teaching like in a teacher ed program, but that experience and like how she lived and worked for those couple of months really shaped why she wanted to be a teacher, and she's been doing really well ever since. So I think that, being able to share that experience also lends again into like who you are and like what passions you bring. Because that's something else I look for is what passion does this person have that's going to, like I just said, impact the experience that our kids have. If you like what you know about pedagogy, again, be honest about that. My full job is to work with beginning teachers. So I would say out of my 8, I have 1 that has any pedagogy experience. And that's for us, like we work on different things. So sharing, this is what I know about pedagogy. This is what I know about instruction. This is what I know about data could also be really helpful. Because I think for someone like me who works with beginning teachers, it's helpful to know, okay, this is where so-and-so is coming in with. And this is how, like, if they're going to work with me, this is what I might need to start with or figure out how to leverage with them. Student teaching experiences, like it says here, that's also very helpful. But again, y'all, just be honest. Don't feel like you have to make up a story to impress your interviewer. If you feel like you have to do that, that's probably not the place you want to be anyway. But be honest about your experiences, be authentically you, because that matters. And we need more authentic educators who are passionate about kids and communities, because that is what truly shapes strong education. The other stuff, like Michael, like Mary said, I agree with, we can teach y'all. But we can't teach you to be authentically you, and we can't teach you the relationship piece, which is really, really key. And if you're working on that, say you're working on it. That's okay.
Go ahead, Mary. I'll go next. Go ahead.
I was just going to say too, like whenever you're interviewing with a team of teachers, I know it is stressful, you guys, but smile, be friendly. If you can even like laugh at some point, remember these teachers are hiring who they're going to spend their day with. And that goes so far. Half of it is what you say maybe, But the other whole half of it is your presence, your smile. Do they want to spend their day with you? Do they want their kids to be in your classroom? So make sure that that personality of yours comes through, because it goes so far.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go 2 points off directly off of that, and then one other thing that I want to go to this third question of not. So let me start with the not. Here's what you should not do. Don't try to be an expert on things that you don't really understand, right? And so I think that's you have to be very careful though, because again, we've done this long enough that it flags. And so we had a gentleman come in. We interviewed him on Teams last summer, but he decided he wanted, I think he probably read the website and learned a little bit about me, but decided he wanted to bring up an article, and how he applied the article was completely off, right? And it was painfully obvious to everyone in the room that you chose something to talk about because you thought it would interest me, but you don't really have the expertise. And this was not a first year teacher. But I would caution you to be very careful there, right? Like just, stay in the lane of the things that you know, and share those things and share them honestly and share them well. And be careful not to get sidetracked into other things, because again, lots of those things will come out a little bit differently. And then the other thing that I always do is when I get a candidate that I'm really interested in, particularly when we are pre and post pandemic, I tend to take the person after the interview and take a walk with them. And the honest answer is I get more out of walking with someone than I do sitting through the interview questions. And so lots of times I'll say, hey, let's loop around the school one time. Let me show you around. And what I would tell you is, if a principal does that with you, you need to take advantage of that moment, because they are trying to get to know you a little bit more as a person. And sometimes we get those answers, and sometimes I can get a better feel for my candidate when I'm standing in a classroom than I can when I'm sitting in the conference room, right? So I would say take advantage of those moments.
I would say that's definitely a back pocket one that I use, Michael. Definitely, if I take you on a walk around the school, that means I really like you and I want to show you my campus and get more experience with you. I'll also say this, and I can't believe I forgot to say this, y'all. So the most important piece of our interviews are students. So we invite students to our interviews, and they serve on the interview committee. So depending on what school you go to, what district, whatever, you might have students that are on the panel. And the thing that I love about our students being on the interview panel is that the kids are going to be honest. They're going to ask tough questions. Sometimes I can't gauge what they're going to ask. I'm thinking about a couple of kids now who do really well with, if you said something, they're going to ask a really good follow-up question. And I'm at the high school level again. So our kids have a lot of questions. They want to look forward to, okay, you might be their teacher. So they have questions that they want to know because you might be their teacher, or you might be teaching with a family community school. So you might teach their cousin or their younger brother or sister or whomever. So students could be a part of your interview panel. Don't let that, scare you, but know that kids are going to ask, well, our kids do. They ask really challenging questions. And when they give us feedback, we'll say, okay, well, how did that go? And they're very honest. And that's something that I really appreciate. And I'm very glad that we do that, because it also includes all of us on that process. So we have teachers and we have kids choosing the right folks for our community. So I can't believe I forgot to say that. That's actually like the biggest thing that we have as far as interviews. And I think it's a really cool thing that we leverage. So don't shy away from kids, answer their questions, and also know that they can read a mile away. So be honest in your responses and authentic to you.
I love that you have students in your interviews. I think that's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is our last. Yep, this is our last slide. Oops. Spoiler alert, we're going to thank you at the end. So when you're finding a job, and this is kind of my biggest question, like, where do we even begin to look for a teaching job? I guess, where do you guys post your teaching jobs? And then I know some other people had questions about like how insurance or retirement plans vary between counties, and just any last advice you have for finding a teaching job or for interviews before we go to the open Q&A.
Yeah, so check district websites, right? Like that's the spot. So check those district websites. That's where those things are going to be listed. Every district looks a little bit different. I'm in Cabarrus. We use AppleTrack, and so everything's housed there. Lots of state districts now are using NC Teacher Match, right? And so, and then I would say, you've got to be satisfied with the area geographically that you choose to live in, right? So I know me. I need to be near a city. Right, like I'm unhappy if I'm not gonna do well out in a rural area because I need to eat food from different parts of the world. Right, that's an important part of my life. Right, so even as I would say now, even as I explore opportunities that come up to me now, I'm always careful to kind of look at that and say, okay, is it somewhere that I can be comfortable and that I would enjoy living. Right, and on the flip side of that. We hired a young man a few years ago that ended up moving back to a more rural part of the state because what he found when he landed with us is Charlotte was too much for him, right? Like he thought that was an adventure he wanted to have, but that geographically the pace of that was way faster and than anything that he had ever dealt with. And, the honest answer is some of the things that we deal with in the community where I live are a little different than they look like in other parts of the country. And so, while kids are kids, right? Like you got to be comfortable with where you are. So I would say you begin with that of like, where am I comfortable? Do I want an adventure or do I have a certain kind of area that I want to look in? And then, take a look at that state map and start, dig through those district sites, right? Really dig through and find those spots. And that's where you'll find things posted.
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest things that I would say, like, as you're starting to map out where you would go, looking for like what part of the state you want to live and work in. For me, I moved to North Carolina. From Florida, sorry. I was like, from where? From Florida. So I happened to land in Eastern North Carolina. I'm about, from my house, about 45 minutes from Raleigh. So I can get to Raleigh fairly quickly. I'm about 30 minutes from Edgecombe County. So Edgecombe is maybe about an hour or so from Raleigh. So like that also was really important to me that I had access. But I fell in love with the community where I live and work. And so I just like stayed. And I also know that I can go 45 minutes. So like Michael, like that was important to me to know that I had access to a city when I wanted it, but I really enjoy my quiet rural life because I grew up in a city. I grew up in Orlando, so it's always busy all the time. But I would say like, think about that. Consider where would you want to go for your teaching job? Look on the school's website. So I know our district, it'll have like employment opportunities, and then the employment opportunities will be listed. We use NC Teacher Match. So I know different districts use different things, but we use NC Teacher Match, and that's how our principals get access to the applicants. Sometimes, like I've also worked in a charter school, so sometimes like they'll put them on, like if you Google it, it'll come up on whatever like website it is for jobs. I don't know what it's called, but I know people who have sent in applications and it's like come in that way. Also while I'm here, sorry, I'm gonna park here. Also consider like if you are someone who's like traditional public school, charter school, private school. All those things are different. They offer different things, oftentimes, different experiences, different philosophies. So as you're thinking about where to apply, start to consider which field is yours. My heart is in public school, so of course I advocate for that. But I mean, it's different for everybody. The school experience is different for everyone. So as you're looking for a job, also consider like which pathway or what school you'd like to start in. If you're like, charter school sounds like somewhere where I'd like to be. In addition to like geographically, what area or part of the state you would like to be in. And we need y'all in North Carolina, so I hope y'all stay in North Carolina.
And I would just say, as far as like benefits and stuff like that, North Carolina, you guys would all be state employees. So our benefits are pretty similar as far as like retirement, stuff like that. But some counties offer a supplement to that state level pay. And you can look at the websites of districts and find their pay scales and stuff like that. Usually those are posted. So you can kind of do a little research behind the scenes. And one thing too, don't apply to a school that's an hour away when you're not thinking of moving, because you can think, oh, I'm willing to do an hour drive. But when you're a beginning teacher, you're going to have a huge workload anyway. And to have an hour on each end, 2 hours in the car a day, like it's probably just not realistic long term. So try and get as close to that school when you're making a move as you can, because those are things that in the future, your future at that school might not be very long term, because that drive is going to get old. Even though you say it's not when you take the job, it is going to get old. And we're investing a lot in you too as a candidate. We'll be really working to develop and grow you as a teacher. So we want it to be a long-term relationship, just like you do. So the more things you can have in place going into it. So I think that was really good advice, Michael, about even like, do you want to live in a city? Do you want to live in a small town? Do you want to live in the country? Like, those are things that are really important in the long run.
Yeah, and I would say off of that, those hours that first year are a thing, right? Like, and I think that's true for any job, right? So when I was a first year teacher, in order to get good at it, you have to work at it, right? And I was a non-traditional lateral entry first year teacher that didn't know what I was doing, right? So I was working. And then you see that in everything that you do after that, right? So my folks on here that once we took that step into the principalship, that first year of principalship is hard, right? That's a ton of hours. And what you will see is I always tell our first year teachers, you need to commit to 3 years, because year number 1 is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly rewarding, but it's incredibly difficult because you're just immersed in it. And then year 2 is a little easier. And year 3, you're like, oh, I can do this. And then by year 5, you start to pick up some of the tricks. And it doesn't mean that you work any say less. You work hard. Our good people work hard. You will find over time that, number 1, the financial rewards will come, because when you're good, principals take care of you, right? And then number 2, the amount of hours adjusts itself when you get good at some things, right? And what I always tell folks is it doesn't mean you teach the same lessons in year 5 that you taught in year 1, and that's what makes it less. What it means is you get more adept at planning them and knowing what pedagogical step gets you an outcome, right? And so there's a little less time that goes into setting things up as you get more experience. But I think to Mary's point, like, you got to be really careful that first year not to overextend yourself with hours on either end of it, because the truth of the matter is you are going to work a lot. You are going to work a lot of hours that first year, because it's the only way to keep your head above water. It's the most rewarding thing you will ever do in your life, but it is also the most exhausting thing that you will ever do in your life.
And I thought of one more thing too that could be discouraging for you right now is when you see openings, you might email a principal and you don't hear back, or you apply for positions and then you don't get them. But I will say in Wake County, we're a big county. So what often happens is our first round of openings, they get filled by transfer applicants and people moving around within schools. And so a lot of times we're not hiring a beginning teacher first thing. We're looking for, maybe experience and some superstars and some leadership and that kind of stuff. However, there's a whole nother round of openings that happen all summer long. And so as summer goes on, we're more ready to look at beginning teachers then, because we have hired some leaders and we've shifted some staff around. And now those are real openings in the summer that I'm looking for. So not that I can't have one now, but I would typically have more throughout the summer that beginning teachers might be a really good, have a good chance at. So don't get too discouraged if you don't have something already in April or May. Just keep the faith, because the summer's long and openings pop up that we don't even know about right now.
And don't take something that you don't feel good about, right? Like when you come out of an interview and you don't feel good and you think, oh my gosh, I got to get my job. Don't do that. Like, sit tight and you're going to find the right one is going to have, we find the good people, right? And so I think to Mary's point, I do very little hiring other than transfers between now and about the middle of May. And then I'll really start looking at filling my spots with folks that are external to the district about the middle of May. But I would tell you as a first year teacher, like, hang on, because you have to come out of it feeling good. So I would say there are few enough of you and more than enough jobs for you to be patient and find the one you want, rather than jumping at the first thing that jumps at you. You want to be really careful. You got to, and if you don't feel good, that's a sign that you need to keep looking.
And a little encouragement for you. We do a big, huge job fair. And every year at this job fair in May, I go through my resumes and the interviews that I have at that job fair, and I'll pick like 10 or 15 people that I'm interested in. So if I have an opening later in the summer, I'll pull right from those same resumes and applicants that I already screened and know I was interested in that person. And I will tell you guys, almost always when my opening is at in July and August, all 15 of those people that I was interested in are now hired. So you'll land on your feet. It will be okay. You will find something. It's just not always quite as quick as you want it to be.
All right, thank you. Well, unless you guys have any other specific advice that comes to mind, we're going to open up the floor to people in the audience who have questions to ask. So feel free to unmute or ask in the chat.
I've got one. How long is appropriate to keep y'all waiting? I know you talk about how we might have to play the waiting game, but if you happen to have teachers that may be applying in different counties or maybe have a couple different schools, is it okay if we kind of take a week or so in the summer to decide which school is right for us? And also my second question is, do you recommend first year teachers picking up extracurricular responsibilities or coaching or anything else? Because I've heard mixed things about that.
Yeah, so I always tell people just to be honest with me when they're looking. Like, when I call and say, I'd like to move forward with your, I never offer, right? Like, there's lots of things that happen before we get an actual offer, but we're interested. I'd like to move forward with you. I always tell people, be honest with me if you need to take a day or two to think on it. Now, on the flip side of that, I'll tell you that if I get somebody that puts me off 2 weeks, I will have moved on. Right. So the answer to that is I always get, the window for me is somewhere between 3 and 5 days, because the reality of it is I run a school that's really good. Right. Like so I have other people that are sitting there that want to come in on that. So I think what you've got to have is this idea. I think it goes back to what we said earlier of like, you need to strategically apply, right? Like mass applying and going and interviewing in 30 places is probably not your best idea. You need to say, okay, here are the places that I know I want to be. Here are schools that kind of fit the profile of what I'm interested in. And that way you can come back to a principal with a pretty, within a reasonable amount of time. If folks, for me, honestly, that go over 5 days, unless they are just a known commodity that's a superstar, I'm probably not stretching it out much longer than that, right? Like I have some people on my list that I call every year because I know if I can ever get them, I'm going to grab them, right? That they're kind of entrenched in other schools, but I know if they ever were to look, I call them. And if that person says to me, hey, I need some time to think on it, like I'm more apt to do it. But with a first year teacher, I'm moving pretty quick on it.
Me too. I would not, when I'm ready to hire, I'm ready to hire. So I would just say, probably if you're interviewing and it feels right and you get an offer, take it. And if it doesn't feel right, then don't take it no matter what.
Yeah.
Okay.
And extracurriculars, honestly, that's at the secondary level. It depends on how quick you get your feet under you, right? So I always tell my first year folks to be careful taking them on, especially at the beginning of the year. And I tend to shield them quite a bit at the beginning of the year. Like, no, you're going to need to take a minute and get your feet under you. And so if you want to coach track, like in the spring, that might be a conversation that I'm willing to have with you. Now, the flip side of that is I have had some folks, even some BT1s that have come in and they're going to coach football, right? Like I knew when I interviewed them, I knew that's what I was interviewing them for. But I also kind of shoulder the burden of that when that happens of like, okay, I know I've got to put extra support around this person because I'm hiring them with the intention that they're going to coach football for me. So, the honest answer is there are times that's what I'm looking for. for at a secondary level. Like I've got to, I mean, I'm gonna be a little cliche-ish here, but like I get into social studies opening where the reality is I have to have coaches. And so when I get a social studies opening, sometimes on the front end of that, like I don't post it with that, but I know in my mind. Now, having said that, if I get a rock star that doesn't coach, I'm hiring a rock star teacher first every single time, and I'll figure the rest of it out, right? But yeah, I would say be very cautious and careful on taking on too much, because again, the number of hours that you're going to work to get your feet under you is a thing.
And I was actually going to answer like that second question for you from the high school perspective. As you can probably imagine, sports are life. Sports run a lot for our kids, especially the older they get, which means that it requires a lot of time from our coaches who also serve as teaching staff. So what I would say to you is, if like, Jamila wouldn't recommend it, maybe the spring semester, but if you're like football is life and I want to coach football, and it's your first year teaching and you're in an area that's like heavily tested, or like, you know, just like in general, I would definitely not recommend that until you get like some placement. Maybe if you want to like support coaches, sure. But for me, academics instruction comes first. Our student athletes know that, and they know that in order for them to be able to do what they do on the field and do it well, they also have to show up in the classroom. And so whenever I look for someone, especially a first year teacher or a teacher in general, who's like, I want to be a coach, I'm also like, okay, well, what's your philosophy on instruction? Because that also matters. And how we're graduating our athletes matters to me. So just like something to keep in the back of your mind, is that you can coach. I imagine it's gonna be really hard, and Jamila wouldn't recommend it, but it's challenging, especially I think in secondary in general, but especially high school, because again, sports are life.
Yeah, so am I muted? Yeah, I was a high school basketball coach, and I will tell you that when I look back at that, I was single at the time. It was prior to I had to quit. I didn't have to quit, but I quit when I got married and had children, right? Because I started looking at the hours that I was working there of 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. at times, and then rolling back into Concord High School to teach another 7 o'clock class the next morning. And I was when I took that first high school job, I was an 8 or 9 year veteran, right? And so that wore me out. So I'm always kind of tell people like you need to be careful. Y'all okay if I jump over to a couple of the chat questions real quick? So I think job experience is job experience. So I think what it goes back to is, how can you take what you've done and connect it to what you want to be and what you want to do? And so retail job experience is great if you're spinning it for me on like, I trained other people, or you want to show me what your work ethic looked like, right? Like, here's a project I took on. And this is something that I did. Like, don't be afraid to share those things. I think any job experience where you can spin it back and say, because one of the things we're looking for is judgment and reflectiveness, right? Like, I took this job and I learned this skill out of this job, right? And this is a spot where I grew and got better. So I think that's an important piece of it.
I have a couple quick questions. One, do you guys give any weight to letters of recommendation? If so, like, what do you look for? And second of all, would it be advantageous to provide like examples of your teaching material, like recordings of you teaching, or lesson material you've come up with?
I like to see lesson plans, right? So I will, particularly with BTs, I'll ask to see some of the things that came out of an ed TPA or lesson plans I do that with lots of folks anyway. Like, I want to make sure I don't get snowed in an interview lots of times. So I will ask, especially if something sounds too good to be true, I'll ask to see it. So I always like it when folks come in with something that's not massive to show me, right? I always kind of get tickled when people bring the 6-inch notebook in too, of like, oh yeah, I ain't going through that. Like, don't bring that in here because I'm not going to look at that. So something small, right? A folder with some stuff in it that you're super proud of that you want to show off is always really good. And then your references, like, you need to be really thoughtful on who you pick, because the honest answer is it's the last thing I'm going to do before I decide if I'm going to hire you. That and a background check is the last thing I'm going to do. You want to get the right references in there, right? Like, I want people who can really tell me about you. And I do take them very seriously. Like, I am really trying to get at a person's character when I check those references. So I would be very careful about who you use and make sure that they can really speak to who you are. So those are the things that I would say. The other thing that I'll tell you just is reality, right? I'm always going to ask a person that I'm interested in about their background check before I get the results of the background check. And I'm asking that question because there's this kind of spot of honesty that I recognize that when people are in college, they do dumb things every once in a while. And generally, I can get a DWI that happened during your sophomore year. I can generally get something like that through human resources if you're a first year teacher. But I cannot get that through human resources if you fail to tell me about it and I find out about it on a background check. If I get that on a background check, there's an honesty problem there and I'm not going to hire you. And so I always tell my folks, we had a gentleman a few years ago who was super honest and upfront with me. He's one of the best teachers I got, but he made a mistake, right? 10 years earlier, he'd made a mistake. And so I can navigate those kind of things through human resources. So I would tell you on those, when we think about references and background checks, you need to be completely honest with the principal when you get to that point, because something that will derail you quick is me finding something out about you that I should have known before you left that interview. Or I wouldn't say interview, but at minimum, when I call and say, we'd like to move forward with you. And I say, I'm going to get my information back in a week. Is there anything that I should know? That needs to be an honest answer.
Hey, Allie, I know it's 6:02, but there's one question in the chat that I want to answer. Do we have time to answer that question? Or do I have time to respond to it?
I will leave that totally up to you. I want to be respectful of your spring break. So if you want to stay longer and answer those questions, that would be great, but we're not going to hold you captive. So if you need to leave, I totally understand. But thank you guys so much for taking time out of your days. I know you're all busy, and just thank you for the awesome work that you guys are doing.
Thanks, Allie. I am, the beach is going to be there, so it'll be fine. But I do want to answer this question about beginning teachers who student taught during the pandemic. Number one, though, it's been challenging this year. Very proud of you for teaching and still lending your expertise in a pandemic. I think that's being very ambidextrous, because oftentimes what we learn in teacher ed programs, in my opinion, didn't necessarily lend to me coaching and supporting teachers through the pandemic and virtual learning. So I think that it takes a very ambidextrous muscle to do both. And what I would say to, I think Moritz is your name. Please correct me if I'm not right. But what I would say is that that's something I would definitely include in my resume. Something that I'm looking for right now as we're gearing up and getting ready for interview season is how, folks who have taught in the pandemic, what did they learn? What were some of the skills, expertise that they built? What were some of the muscles that they built? And hearing about how those experiences went, so that gives me a lens on, okay, we're talking about restructuring instruction, talking about what does instruction look like moving forward. We're looking at next school year as ground zero. So we're okay, this is our opportunity to really build, lack of better words, do back better. So we're really looking at how do we support that and support teachers. So you saying, hey, I student taught in a pandemic, and these were some of the things that I got a chance to do. And here are some of the experiences that I had. I really think that could be the way you market it, A, but two, B, that could really be a strong selling point, especially as schools are considering, some school districts are gonna have a virtual aspect next year. And some schools might not, but I think that there's something that could be applied that you've done virtually that could transfer itself physically, and that would happen with the support that you get from the school that you go to. So in my case, that'd be my job to support whoever comes in. But if you tell me that, hey, I had an experience virtually where I led this lesson, and this is what the scope was, and here are the data points from that, I can work with that. So don't be afraid to lend yourself to your virtual experience. Don't be afraid to talk about what you experience now, because like I said, I feel like this is just a very ambidextrous point that educators are developing a really strong muscle. And some of the physical things like classroom management will look different. Those are all things that you can get coached around. And
we'll help you. We'll help you there. We know we've got to help folks that are coming in with that.
And not just BT1s,
right.
Because the reality is, I've got some vets who got used to not having kids or like having a lot of kids in the classroom this year. So that's just going to be something that all of my teachers get. So don't feel like, you're coming in to everybody having something that you don't. We're all in this thing and learning this thing together. So how you sell, and I hate to say sell that way, but how you like talk about your experiences in virtual and remote learning is going to be really important. So don't shy away from that and think about how you might want to use that to your advantage. Because I'm definitely looking for someone who says that, hey, I've had this type of success, especially if it's like relationship success. How have you had that relationship success virtually? And then how might that transfer when you come into the classroom? Because that's going to be a huge thing that I'm thinking about when all of our babies return. How do the adults in their lives show up and pour love into them? And how do we show up and pour love into our adults? But definitely, how are our teachers wrapping around support for our kids? Because that's going to be something that we'll have to do when all of our kids come back, I think, in the fall. So that's a very good question. And I know there's more, so I'll lend the floor to Mary and Michael.
All right, well, unless anyone has any last minute questions or comments, thank you guys again for coming out during your spring breaks. We all really appreciate it. I know I had a lot of my questions answered, and it was really probably one of the most useful PGUs I've ever been to, so thank you.
Great. Happy to help anytime. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, y'all take care. Congratulations.
Good luck on your job search.
Thank you.
Mhm.